Well, we have been working our way through the book of Hebrews, and we find ourselves, Hebrews chapter 11. Hear these incredible words. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancestors were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God. Because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear, built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the land, a promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him for the same promise. For he was looking forward to a city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he, as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they had died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of a country they had left it, they would have the opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to call them their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who embraced the promise was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshiped as he leaned on top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered. He saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute, Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with the others who were disobedient. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jehoshaphat, about David and Samuel and the prophets, whom through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouth of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle, routing foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in the desert, and deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith. Yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us they would be made perfect. Simply incredible words. Pray with me as we get started. Our Father in heaven, grow in us today a faith that is dedicated to stay the course during the hardest times in life, God. I pray that your Spirit would work to give us the eyes of faith to see the world through heaven's eyes, to see the invisible God just like Moses did. Pour through me the gift of preaching, that the endurance of Christ may grow in our hearts. I pray this all in the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. Hebrews 11 paints a picture better than any Da Vinci or Van Gogh could ever paint. The painting starts. But first, before we can see how this painting is picked apart, I have to show you this picture. It's a famous picture called Yankee Boys. If we could go to the next slide, Steve. It was August 17, 1948. And something about these four boys is so relatable to me. It was 70 degrees on that Tuesday afternoon. Joe DiMaggio went 1 for 3, had 2 RBIs. Yogi Berra went 3 for 5 and had 2 RBIs. The Yankees won 8-1 against the Washington Senators. And the funniest thing to me about this picture is, where are these four boys on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-August? Why aren't they at school? What's going on here? So we ask, on a Tuesday afternoon in August, why is this photo so famous? Well, it was the day after Babe Ruth died. Babe Ruth was maybe arguably the best Yankee of all time, maybe the best baseball player of all time. And if you wanted to remember Babe Ruth, well, there was one place you'd go to remember Babe Ruth. Yankee Stadium. You'd go there. You'd see it. You'd mourn. You'd grieve with everyone grieving this loss. And these four boys, they're there. Almost. I mean, they're at the stadium, but they're not in the stadium. They can smell the hot dogs. They can hear them sing the 7th inning stretch. They can hear the bats as they hit. They can hear the crowd. They're participating in it, but they're not there yet. Almost, but not yet. And I wonder what happened to these 4 boys. You know, like, did they maybe find their way in? At a certain point, did someone say, okay, you guys have been standing out front long enough. Come on in. Maybe they bought some tickets. Maybe they found a way in. Or maybe they just said, you know what, it's time to go home. Mom's cooking dinner. It's probably really warm and fresh. Let's home. Maybe they got tired. Maybe one at a time they left heading home. Or maybe they did make it into the stadium. I don't know. But here's what I do know. The first people to hear the book of Hebrews felt like these 4 boys. They were grieving. They had gone through difficult times. They had lost everything for fallen Christ. Their family, their property, their businesses, their homes, everything. And they are standing on the cusp of everything that is promised to them, that we've been hearing about in past chapters. This great reward that they are due if they will just hang on. In this chapter, we're seeing all this stuff about this city being prepared for them. And they're going, what do I do? Do I wait to get in? Or do I head back? And we have times in our life where faith feels like that. Where we're standing saying, oh, how do we get in? Can I get in? We're waiting. We're longing for something better. And we're trying to decide, do I find a way in or do I quit and give up and go back home? And so we've learned that the motto of the early church was this line, this phrase from the book of Habakkuk, the righteous will live by faith. And so we seek to live by faith, but the obvious question is, how do we do that? And thankfully, the foundation of the picture that the Hebrew preacher is painting is, how do we live by faith? And it all starts with the definition. Now, faith is the confidence in what we hope for and the assurance of what we do not see. Now, today, not tomorrow, not yesterday, not back then, not sometime in the future. Now, faith is what we hope for. This is what faith looks like. Faith is confidence in our hope. And oftentimes we think of faith like blind confidence. Like, you know what, I hope the Broncos would go to the Super Bowl this year. But I have no confidence they're actually going to do it, right? There is no confidence there that they will make it to the Super Bowl this year. We're in the running, apparently, highest odds for the number 1 pick next year, okay? That's maybe how the season's going to go. We'll see. But I'm hopeful. And sometimes we think about faith like, I'm just going to have this blind faith that has no rationale behind it. And the Hebrew preacher goes, no, I've been building this for the entire sermon. Faith is confidence. And why do we have confidence? Well, according to the book of Hebrews, we have confidence because of Jesus. Because what Jesus has done, is doing, and will do. Jesus is our reason for confidence. Jesus gives us the faith. So, in other words, we have confidence that God can be trusted. Faith, then, is this inward sense, this building, this trust, this confidence in God. But faith is actually also assurance. See, the same Greek word used here in assurance was used in the first chapter in the book of Hebrews to describe Jesus' nature as actually the very being of God. That in fact, Jesus is the carbon copy, the exact representation of God. The point the Hebrew preacher is trying to get across is that faith is the very being of God's promises. So confidence and assurance, these two words work together to describe faith, and they could almost be synonyms. But the preacher is trying to create a distinction between what looks like inward and outward faith. See, as Christians, we have this inward confidence, but it manifests to this outward assurance. We have this inward confidence in God, but we also have this outward assurance that gives us faith to advance and operate behind enemy lines. Faith inwardly chants, we shall overcome, but outwardly marches next door to serve and love our neighbor. Faith inwardly trusts God's
promises that one day the mourning, the crying, and the pain will be no more, while simultaneously faith outwardly prays for those who mourn, serves tirelessly those who weep, works tenderly to ease the pain of those who are hurting. Here is what I'm trying to say. Inwardly, faith moves our heart. Outwardly, faith moves mountains. But faith takes eyes. Faith takes eyes to see the unseen. The glimpses of the world to come, the realities of the heavenly kingdom, and sometimes all our eyes can see is the pain, is the hurt, is the suffering of a fallen world, the selfishness, the greed, and the setbacks we see around us, or maybe even are present in our own lives. However, given all the realities of this world, faith has the ability to see with the inner eye what the outward eye cannot see. Faith is the ability to see that the universe is not aimlessly swirling out of control, but that God created the universe as an expression of love sustained by God. And so the preacher is going to give a list of examples of different things that happen here, different examples of faith, and is going to go chronologically through the Bible. And the first thing he starts with is not a person. It's creation. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. It's biblical evidence for the Big Bang Theory, that suddenly, out of nothing, God created everything. It just appeared into this three-dimensional world. And I love how the old theologian John Calvin puts it. He says it like this. If we could go to that slide. If God should withdraw his hand a little, all things would immediately perish and dissolve into nothing. The first evidence for faith is creation. The second is Abel. Poor Abel was the first victim of murder. He brought his best in the form of a sacrifice, and his jealous brother killed him for it. And Abel never says a recorded word in the scriptures. We know nothing of what he says, but in Genesis it says that his blood cried out to God. His example of faith is that his inner faith would take an outward action to bring a portion back as an offering to God, even if it meant dying for it. The next person described is Enoch, this obscure character from chapter 5 in the book of Exodus. Enoch was so pleasing to God that he was taken directly to heaven without passing through death's universal door. And just like Abel, Enoch's faith pleased God. In fact, after describing Enoch, the Hebrew preacher pauses in verse 6 to teach an important lesson on faith. See, without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe he exists and he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Our faith towards God is the thing that pleases God. You want to go home and please God today? Have faith. But no one pleases God unless you step out in faith. God rewards us. How cool is it to think that when we step out in faith, God rewards us for doing that? The next person who we talk about is Noah. Now, while everyone was participating in all kinds of debaucheries, Noah starts building a boat. I mean, how much faith would it take to build a boat while all that's going on? It's a holy fear kind of faith. That's how it's described here. And think about the embarrassment, the jokes. Like, look at this conspiracy theorist, right? Building this boat. It seems so weird until the floods came. And his faith that God would keep his promises, literally condemned the world. Have you ever considered how God wants to use your faith to show the world God's goodness? How could God do that through that? Next, the Hebrew preacher is going to spend a great deal of time on Abraham and Sarah. They followed God all through the land where God was calling them, and they didn't have a history like we have, a history of God's faithfulness, but they still had faith. And they were as good as dead because they were past the age of bearing children, and they might have laughed at God's plans, but ultimately God was faithful and God rewarded their faith. And they longed for a better place to live. And it was hard for them. Every time they would enter into a foreign land, the king would come and Abraham would claim that Sarah was his sister instead of his wife. And it seemed like Abraham was more likely to be the founder of Arkansas than Israel. Yet still, he was faithful. In response to something very interesting, it's pointed out in verse 16, therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God. The closest thing I can think of in comparing this is parenting. You know, one of the gifts of being a parent is embarrassment. Okay? Your children do things that are simply embarrassing. Any of you ever had kids do this before? Am I the only one? I've got 2 kids, and one of them more than the other tends to do this. You probably know which one I'm talking about. And the choice is, am I going to be proud of them? Am I going to love them? Am I going to be there for them? Am I going to stand by them? Right? It's one of the gifts God gives us. And the quality we see here, that when we stand in faith, even in the midst of our mistakes, Abraham and Sarah were full of mistakes, but they stepped out in faith. And the quality is, God says, man, I'm so proud of them. I'm so proud to be there. They're going to call me their God. Can you think about it today? What would it look like in your life to realize God's proud of me? God's proud of my faith. God's proud that I am stepping out and following Him. And speaking of children, the Hebrew preacher brings up one of the craziest stories in the Bible. When God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, and it's such a bizarre story on so many levels, but mostly because God promised He would make a great nation out of Isaac. And it's like, what are you doing here, God? This is the one you promised. What are you going to do? And this is where faith gets really, really big. Abraham trusted God so much, we find out in Hebrews 11, that he reasoned that even if he were to sacrifice Isaac, God had the ability to bring back Isaac from the dead. Yep. And in the first book of the Bible, we see in Genesis the foundation for Jesus coming to earth. An only son, sacrificed and offered for all of us, brought back to life. We see at the end of the lives of Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, they all had experienced God's faithfulness, but it had not been fully realized. That they had faith in death, that God was going to actually be faithful to the ancestors after them, which brings us to Moses. Moses could have lived a selfish life of leisure in Pharaoh's castle. I mean, how tempting would that have been? To basically be assistant to the president and a billionaire all at the same time. He had it all. He could have just stayed there. But he didn't do that. For the sake of Christ, not just for God, for the sake of Christ, Moses lived by faith. He tried to take matters into his own hands a few times. He came up with different excuses, but it didn't work. But every time Moses decided to trust God, God provided. I mean, think about the action that it took to march into Pharaoh's castle, into his chambers, and to say, "Let my people go." And then to think, man, God, I just declared a plague. I really hope you bring the plague. You know what was the sin like at home? Or to take everyone out in the desert, to put the blood of the lambs over the doors so they would be passed over. To pillage Egypt as they left, as they handed out their gold. Standing on the sea, cornered, saying, God, what are we going to do now? And the sea opens up. That is big faith. But the last person the Hebrew preacher really highlights is Rahab, the foreign prostitute who lived in the walls of Jericho. Jericho would have been one of the safest, most secure places to be in all of the ancient world. Huge castles, a huge wall. She is secure. But Rahab had the faith to believe that the God that was coming was bigger than the walls she was living in. That is big faith. So she hid the spies. And could you imagine what it would have been like for Rahab? To see these guys marching around, and every day she throws her red rope out the window. And then one day, suddenly, all the walls come tumbling down, but hers. That is reward for great faith. But God has more in store than that. And her faith in action actually rewarded her so greatly, she is one of the great-great-grandmothers of Jesus. The preacher does something again. He cuts things short. He keeps doing that. Don't you hate it when preachers cut things short, right? You may not think I'm doing that right now, but I am. And I would have loved to hear everything that he was going to say about all these Old Testament people, David, the prophets, all the other Old Testament people. We can see references to Daniel in the lion's den, to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego going into the fiery furnace, to Elijah and Elisha raising the kids from the dead. But then the references become more vague, with horrible descriptions of people being flogged, tortured, sewn, sawed in two, killed and persecuted by the sword. Terrible things. And this is where scholars are confused. What was he referencing? Was he referencing Old Testament people in Old Testament times? Was he referencing people during the Maccabees age? Maybe. I tend to think, based on the descriptions, he was referencing Christians they all knew. People who had been martyred, people who had lost, who had given up everything, that when he's making those references, they are thinking of names that either people they know or are acquaintances with, or they had heard things about. And the Hebrew preacher, all he can just say is about them is the world did not deserve them. And then the last paragraph, the preacher slows things down. He slows it down in order to teach us an important lesson about faith. He says, these were all commended for their faith, yet none of them had received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us they would be made perfect. The key word here is better. We like better, right? We generally want better, especially for ourselves, for our lives. We want better. Guess what? Better shows up 11 times in the book of Hebrews. Better is one of the key parts of the entire book. And so one of the key themes we find out in the book of Hebrews is how much better life is when following Jesus. Amen. The audacity for the Hebrew preacher to preach this to people who have lost everything. Said, oh, you've lost it all? It's okay. I've got better. I have got better. And so if we want to find better in life, we have to have faith. Faith is what it takes to find better. All these people listed received rewards in their life because of their faith. But it wasn't, their great reward wasn't until their death. At the end, see, they were always living by faith. They never got to opt out of faith. And sometimes I think we talk about faith like we talk about retirement, right? Like we have a few faith challenges and we get through those faith challenges and then we go, you know what? Oh, it's fine. We're good now. I'm retired from faith. I already did that. I came through those things. No. That's not how life works. You might be able to retire from work, but you never get to retire from faith. Faith is a lifelong mission and challenge. But after death, if we have great faith, the reward comes. And throughout the chapter, the Hebrew preacher has been hinting at this reward, a holy city waiting for us. And it can be fun to speculate and study and talk about what this reward might look like and what might be waiting for us. We can kind of feel like a kid on Christmas, at Christmas, thinking about it. But ultimately, it comes down to faith. Faith that what is waiting for us is so much better than anything this fallen world can provide for us. Beyond anything we can ask and imagine is waiting for us. And all of this leads to a common question, especially when it comes to faith, especially with new Christians. See, people sometimes really want to prove their faith. They want to have answers to all the questions. They want to use the scientific method to prove it all. They need the concrete evidence. They kind of start to sound like Thomas. He's got a reputation for doubting. Until I see the nails in his hands and the hole in his side, I'm not going to believe. And let me tell you, if you want to live your faith this way, you will never find the answers you are looking for. Jesus tells Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. But blessed are those who do not see and yet still believe. God has designed this world so we will always have to reach out in faith. It will always come down to faith for us. So spoiler alert, as long as you are living, you will always wrestle with doubts, questions, challenges, struggles, and fears. And you have to make a decision for yourself. What will you do with those things? Can you step out in faith and wait to get into that holy city, or do you want to turn around and go back? But it always comes back to faith. And this brings me back to the Hall of Fame. Every sport has a Hall of Fame. And I'm quickly reminded of how just in one generation we forget who was in the Hall of Fame. I never saw Babe Ruth play. All I know about Babe Ruth was from watching the movie Sandlot, okay? There's not very much to go on, right? Growing up watching sports, my grandpa would always tell me about these Hall of Fame players, okay? Now, we're big Broncos fans, right? So he'd tell me about a linebacker named Tom Jackson or a running back for the Broncos named Floyd Little. They called him the franchise. He literally kept the franchise here. They would have moved if it wasn't for him coming here. Or this guy named Randy Gradishar, a defensive player for the Broncos who just recently went into the Hall of Fame, but I never saw any of them play. I just have to take his word for it that they're really good. Now I tell Silas about these guys like John Elway and Peyton Manning. He never saw them play. He doesn't know what it like. I try to look up highlights for him, but he just has to trust me that they were really good because all he's ever known his whole life is how terrible the Broncos are. Now I'm preaching, right? And the hard truth is, on this side of eternity, all of our accomplishments, all of our successes are one generation away from completely being forgotten. No one will remember them. Yet here's what I believe. I believe there is a real Hall of Fame waiting for us. Hebrews 11 signifies it, that the ones we will be celebrating for all of eternity, the Hall of Fame, were some of these people and others in Hebrew chapter 11 and more, who when all the odds seemed to be against them, stepped out in faith and followed Jesus when they might have not with their earthly eyes seen what was going on, but with their heavenly eyes were able to see something more. And this all leads me to you. You sitting here today. How are you going to live? You can live in Pharaoh's castle as we get the advantage of living here in this country. You can play it safe. You can take it easy. But can you have the confidence in faith? Can you hope for the assurance that we do not see? See, the challenge is now, and we have all of eternity to reflect on it. And so the painting of Hebrews chapter 11 is not over. He's still painting the beautiful picture. It's just you that he's painting now. You're the one. Your story. Your life. And so, as the writer of Hebrews picks up the pen and puts pen to paper, he starts to write about you. And the line starts, by faith. By faith. Well, we saw today, by faith, Jackson made a decision. Jackson made a decision about how he's going to be writing his story. Outwardly, we see by faith the work that Bella and James have done here to get him to this point. That is faith in action. But you, what do you choose? How do you choose to finish the sentence? By faith.